What's good, everybody? It's Robo back with another video, and today I've got my college football Week 3 picks. Week 3 is pretty lackluster in terms of ranked matchups, but we've got a ton of games with a bunch of close spreads on tap. If I happen to skip over a game, it's because there hasn't been a line set by the time I'm making this video because it's against an FCS opponent, but feel free to ask for my opinion down in the comments below still. But before I get into everything, let me go ahead and recap the Week 2 results. Week 2 was much better than last, going 27-22 against the spread. We saw a couple massive upsets, and I wish I was a bit more aggressive as a few teams that picked to cover as underdogs won the game outright. But anyways, looking towards this week, there aren't many ranked matchups, but a few games I'm really excited for still. So without further ado, let's get started in order of kickoff time as always. Arizona State's gotten off to a really strong start to the year compared to expectations. A definite surprise at how solid they've looked against Wyoming and Mississippi State. This Texas State team is a legitimate test for them, however, as a potential Group of 5 playoff contender. Coming off a massive blowout win over UTSA last week, Jordan McLeod can sling the rock, and they've got a great defense for the Group of 5. I just think Arizona State has looked the part enough to be able to win this type of game on the road, so give me the Sun Devils 33-27. Kansas really sucked last week in the loss at Illinois. They have some work to do as a group if they want to contend in the Big 12 this year, and it starts with taking care of business at home against a Group of 5 contender in UNLV. Matchup-wise, I do like Kansas in this game because I think they have the guys in the secondary to be able to cover Ricky White and company, but Jalen Daniels needs to be much better. 3 picks last week was inexcusable, and this defense is not too far off from Illinois. With that said, back at home, I do expect a much cleaner performance from him, and Kansas has a talent to control this game, so give me the Jayhawks 35-24. Friday night's matchup between Kansas State and Arizona could be the most exciting game of the week heading into it, and I would not be surprised to see this game end up one way or the other. The Noah Fafita and Ted McMillan combo is good enough to beat anybody anywhere, and Kansas State has a star in DJ Giddens and a dual-threat offense built to last. I do worry about this K-State defense a bit, giving up 500 yards at Tulane last week and 350 of that coming through the air. And I think Arizona's going to find success to put themselves in a position to steal this game. But at home under the lights, I'm trusting Avery Johnson and the K-State offense to score enough to survive the scare, 34-30. Alabama at Wisconsin is first up for this Saturday, and it's our first look at a Kalen DeBoer-led Crimson Tide team on the road. They looked pretty sluggish last week against a solid South Florida team before a fourth quarter barrage, and we can see that again up against a very talented Wisconsin secondary. But honestly, this Wisconsin offense has not performed up to standards for me to give them a real look in this game unless Alabama allows them one with turnovers. I think at some point the talent advantage is going to be clear, and Jalen Milroe is going to find a rhythm. But I think Vegas has this game pretty spot on at 16.5 right now. I'm going to take Wisconsin to just barely squeak out a cover at home, 30-14. Oklahoma State is at Tulsa this week after surviving a big-time scare from Arkansas. It wasn't a great day for the run game, averaging just 2 yards a carry, which really hurt that offense. But they should have a much easier time getting Ollie Gordon going in this one, as Tulsa just doesn't have the talent on the front seven to be able to hang around in this game. A clean football game from the Cowboys should lead to a blowout win on the road. We've seen them have some complete duds in the past, but I think this team has too much talent to struggle in this one. So give me Oklahoma State 42-17. Number 16, LSU is on the road at South Carolina this week. After the Gamecocks picked up a huge win on the road at Kentucky 31-6 in Week 2. This defense looked really good all around, and true freshman Dylan Stewart has been an absolute freak of nature on the edge. LSU is definitely on upset alert in this game, as even last week against Nichols they were in a battle until late in the third quarter. Obviously, Nussmeier is a talented quarterback, and the offense has some real playmakers, but I see no reason why South Carolina can't hang around in this game. I just don't trust their offense enough to pick them to win it, even at home, so I like LSU close 31-27. Michigan hosts Arkansas State this week. After seeing how sloppy and lackluster the offense was against Texas, they've got a chance to get things going for once against a far inferior opponent. From offensive line issues to quarterback play to a lack of separation to even tackling, Michigan looks like a team that lost almost everything from a season ago and needs to find its new identity. They have an obvious talent and physicality advantage in this game, and I expect them to keep the ball on the ground and control this one with the run game. Arkansas State's defense hasn't looked much improved from last year, and Michigan should match up well with it, so I'm cautiously taking Michigan to cover here, 38-10. Florida State enters Week 3 without a 1 in the win column, and this one won't be easy to come by either. Maybe the best team in the Group of 5 is coming to town with the Memphis Tigers, with a dynamic offense led by Seth Hennigan and a defense that's really well-rounded. This is obviously a must-win game for the Seminoles, but so is Boston College at home, and they still look terrible. With that said, an 0-3 start to the season would most definitely put jobs in jeopardy, and I still believe they have something in them to turn the season around, so I'm going to take Florida State in a tight one, 28-24. NC State just got embarrassed in Charlotte last weekend against Tennessee and needs a game to put that loss in the rearview mirror and move on with the season. Lucky for them, they've got Louisiana Tech this week, which is a perfect opportunity to right the ship. I expect NC State to roll over one of the worst teams in the FBS and use this week to get on track, because if they aren't able to control this one, there may not be much hope for a successful season of conference play either. Get the ball in the hands of the playmakers and let them take over. I think the Wolfpack get it done, finally, 38-13. Illinois takes on Central Michigan this week after a major program win over Kansas. They played a really solid game defensively and now look like a team who can push for a bowl game and beyond. Central Michigan's coming off a blowout loss at Florida International and did not look remotely like the same offense from week 1. This one should be even tougher than last week, and I just can't see the Chips having much success offensively unless the Illini don't have their heads in it. I like Illinois to be able to dominate on both sides of the ball in this one, 34-10. Cincinnati at Miami, Ohio is probably going to be another ugly defensive game. Miami, Ohio's defense has been good for some time now and opened the season giving up just 13 points in Northwestern. And while I do think Cincinnati has a better offense and a better quarterback than Northwestern, I still expect Matt Salopek, Ty Wise, and Brian Ugwu to affect this game enough to keep it lower scoring, or at least low enough for their offensive issues to not matter as much. And even so, I think Blaine Gabbert could have what it takes to win a rivalry matchup like this at home. I'm going to take the underdogs to keep the MAC rolling with a 24-21 win over Cincinnati. Texas Tech has not gotten off to the start they wanted this season, needing overtime to beat Abilene Christian and then getting beaten down on the road by Washington State. They badly need a strong performance in Week 3 as they host North Texas, who may end up a contender in the American Conference this season, especially with that offense. I think there's a chance this one comes down to the wire if the same Texas Tech team still shows up. And even though I still think the defense will struggle in this one, I'm going to put my faith in Baron Morton and Taj Brooks and ride with the offense to have a day against a weaker defense, 41-28. Missouri and Boston College is our lone ranked matchup of the week this week, and unfortunately there's a good chance it doesn't deliver that great of a game. Missouri has looked phenomenal through 2 weeks, albeit against very weak opponents, but 0 points allowed and a super consistent and efficient offense have me thinking this team may have what it takes to win some playoff games. This is the first opponent with a real threat though, as Thomas Castellanos is a handful to deal with, and BC physically dominated Florida State in their own stadium. I don't think there's much of a chance for them against Missouri, but I do think they can cover if they find success on the ground. Give me Missouri though, 35-20. UMass at Buffalo is a contender for toughest watch of the week. 2 teams who we knew preseason would be pretty abysmal and have shown nothing through 2 games to change that. These type of games typically can go either way, but I will say Buffalo found just a little bit of success running the ball against Missouri and ran for over 200 against Lafayette. I think they can continue to move the ball against UMass on the ground and get enough stops defensively to get the win at home. So I'm going to take Buffalo 28-21. Coastal Carolina at Temple's next, and as I've mentioned in previous weeks, this Temple team may legitimately be the worst team in the FBS this season. Already failing to cover as underdogs to both Oklahoma and Navy. This is their home opener though in Week 3 and a chance to perform better in front of the home crowd. But Coastal Carolina has looked really solid through 2 games, including blowing out Jacksonville State on the road already. Ethan Vasco has a really rough go last week, and I'd expect better from him like we saw in Week 1, so I like Coastal to roll 38-17. Oregon is on the road at Oregon State for their non-conference finale after 2 complete dogfights against Idaho and Boise State at home. There's some obvious issues with this Oregon team they need to figure out because they're too talented to be struggling this much in these games. Eventually, I think things will click for the Ducks and they'll get rolling, but right now, I don't trust them completely, and Oregon State has looked pretty sharp to open up the year, especially with the ground game. I like the Beavers to keep this one within 2 scores at home, but ultimately Oregon wins with too much talent, 34-20. Miami hosts Ball State in Week 3, and it's another chance for Cam Ward to build on his September Heisman resume, as through 2 games he has absolutely dominated. A 75% completion rate, 7 total touchdowns, and over 700 total yards. Ball State stands little to no chance in this one, as they simply just don't have the defense that a team like Northern Illinois had to be able to take down Notre Dame last week. So give me Miami to rack up some points here before the schedule gets a bit tougher. I'll go 49-7. Oklahoma hosts Tulane Saturday after escaping a near loss to Houston this past week. That game was really worrisome offensively, as not only did Jackson Arnold struggle at times, but the run game couldn't get going whatsoever, averaging just 2.6 yards a carry to the same Houston team that got blasted by UNLV. Tulane's a tougher opponent than Houston in my opinion, as we just saw last week with them taking Kansas State down to the wire, but the Sooner defense has been impressive to this point, and I do think the offense can rebound enough to pick up a win this week. I'm going to take the Sooners 31-20. As the entire world knows, Notre Dame is in a rough spot right now after dropping a home game to Northern Illinois after just an abysmal offensive showing. And to top it off, Riley Leonard suffered a minor injury in that game, but was already announced as playing and starting for this week's contest at Purdue. There isn't much reason to trust the Irish right now outside of their defense, which should be good enough to help them escape another disastrous loss. But I don't think this offense has what it takes right now to blow out an opponent, especially on the road, unless they come out on fire. Purdue has enough defensive talent to keep them in the game, but I'm not sure Notre Dame is going to be upset again. So give me the Irish in a closer one, 27-21. Texas A&M at Florida was a really tough game for me to pick this week, as there's some big unknowns with this game. DJ Lagway looked incredible last week, but it was just Samford, and there's a good chance Graham Mertz gets a nod again if he's healthy enough to go. And it's not like he's been a bad quarterback for the Gators at this point by any means, so it could end up being the right choice. Regardless, I see this one being a really tight contest and potentially pretty low scoring. I just trust the A&M defense a bit more than I trust Florida right now, and I think they come out on top in the swamp by just a field goal, 27-24. Nevada let me down last week, falling short at home against Georgia Southern, and while that was going to be a tougher game for them, I just expected a bit more after how the first 2 games of the year went, and it kind of feels like they're back closer to where I thought they'd be this season. Minnesota hosts them this week, and they're coming off a shutout win over Rhode Island. To keep it simple, this team probably should have beaten North Carolina, and Max Brosmer looks pretty solid in this offense. Darius Taylor is back healthy, and I fully expect Minnesota to control this game from start to finish. I like the Gophers by 3 scores, 34-13. The Apple Cup kicks off at 3:30 Saturday with Washington and Washington State facing off from Lumen Field in Seattle. And honestly, I'm not sure what to expect with this game. Both teams are completely different from who they were a year ago. And through 2 weeks, I've honestly been a bit more impressed by the Cougars, hanging 70 on Portland State and then blowing out Texas Tech last week. Now don't get me wrong, Washington hasn't looked bad by any means. They took care of business in both games and dominated Eastern despite the score being just 30-9. I still think they can win this game. I just think in a rivalry game with this much turnover, it'll likely come down to the last possession or so. I'm going to take the Huskies by a field goal, 30-27. The Backyard Brawl is here this week with West Virginia traveling to Pitt for another rivalry matchup. Pitt's coming off an incredible comeback victory at Cincinnati where they erased a 21-point deficit to win 28-27. And Eli Holstein's looked really good in his first 2 appearances. And West Virginia finally came alive in the second half last week to demolish Albany. Garrett Green was great, and the Mountaineers combined for over 300 rushing yards, showing off a bit of what I thought would help them compete against Penn State. As for this matchup, it's usually a tight one between these teams, and I expect it again this season, but I still think West Virginia is the better team and has the playmakers to outlast Pitt in this one. I've gotten the Mountaineers by a touchdown, 31-24. Iowa suffered a heartbreaker blowing a late lead to Iowa State at home last week, thanks to an abysmal day through the air where Cade McNamara was just 13 for 29 for under 100 yards and 2 picks, showing that the offense still has major issues to worry about this season, and they'll be relying on the defense and special teams to take over games throughout the year again. This week, that shouldn't be the case, though, as they host Troy, who sits at 0-2 after losses to both Nevada and Memphis. I don't think Troy has the talent on either side of the ball to keep this game within striking distance, and Iowa should come in pissed off and hungry. Give me the Hawkeyes, 31-3. App State heads to East Carolina this week after getting absolutely stomped on by Clemson. 66 points allowed was not something I expect, but this is a chance to put that game behind them and move on, as East Carolina is without a doubt a team App State can beat. But a 2-0 start and home field advantage for ECU has the spread setting pretty close to even right now. ECU looks pretty improved from last season, but I'm just not going to trust a quarterback who's thrown 7 picks in 2 games to beat a team that I truly think is substantially better. App State's defense needs to show up, but I've got them winning this one on the road, 35-27. Arkansas has looked much better through 2 weeks this season, led by Taylon Green and Jaquindon Jackson, and although they lost in overtime, I was pretty impressed by last week's performance at Oklahoma State. The defense held the ground game in check, and the offense really had it going, putting up 650 yards against a solid defense. Typically, with a spread this high, I wouldn't trust Arkansas, but I think this offense looks like they can score at will against weaker opponents. I'm going to trust them and do it again, especially after how poorly UAB looked last week on the road. Give me Arkansas 45-17. Utah should have covered last week against Baylor. They got off to a 23-0 start before Cam Rising left the game with an injury, and they really collapsed after that offensively. They held on to win it, and now we look to see if Rising can return for this one. If he's out, I'm not sure Utah with the points is a smart play here, but they should be able to win without him still. With how rough the offense looked without him and so much unknown surrounding his status, I'm going to take Utah State to cover this one for now, but Utah to win 31-14. Duke narrowly escaped last week at Northwestern with an overtime victory and a cover, and had several opportunities to put the game away in regulation and failed. But I think it was a confidence building win, as going on the road is never really easy, especially with how new the team and system is. This week they're back home taking on a UConn team that got absolutely demolished by Maryland in week 1, but bounced back nicely against Merrimack with Fanano at quarterback. With that said, Duke looks pretty solid defensively, and I don't expect nearly the same success for them this week. I like Malik Murphy to have a day and get Duke another W, 34-13. Virginia Tech looked better last week against Marshall, taking a step in the right direction after the loss to Vanderbilt, and this week they're on the road at Old Dominion, who's fought some tough games at home in the past, but like I mentioned, I really do think this Virginia Tech team has potential in the ACC. It just needs to find their groove. I think they're the far better team here and shouldn't have too many problems winning this game on the road, so I'm taking the Hokies 35-17. I should have respected FIU even more than I did last week, and I had them covering but not winning outright, and they absolutely blasted Central Michigan with a phenomenal game defensively, forcing 6 turnovers. This week they're on the road taking on rival FAU in the Shula Bowl matchup. FAU still looking for their first win of the season after a close loss at MSU and a blowout loss against Army, and this would be a great time for them to get it up against the in-state rival at home, but with how bad the Owls have looked and FIU's advantage on defense, I'm going to take FIU by a field goal, 24-21. Liberty survived near disaster last week, escaping a bad New Mexico State team with a late defensive score and a final drive to seal the road victory. And now back at home against another inferior opponent, I'm expecting a big bounce-back performance, especially from the offense. There's just way too much talent in this team to be dropping games like they almost did last week, and I think they get it together, beat UTEP with some style. So give me Liberty big, 41-13. Ole Miss has had one of the country's best offenses through 2 cupcake games, and now gets their first taste of the Power 5 with a road matchup against Wake Forest. Wake's coming off a home loss to Virginia where they blew a late 2-score lead, and now having to get back up and respond by taking on an Ole Miss team rolling this well. I don't see this one ending any other way than a blowout. They're just not going to stop this offense, and I think the Rebels have a defense that can make things really tough on Backmeyer. I like the Rebels to cover, 45-14. Texas is back home after a dominant win in Ann Arbor, looking like one of the top 3 teams in the country with a real chance of taking home a national title this season. They'll get a UTSA team coming off an absolute beatdown at Texas State, so there's a storyline of how each team responds after a big win and a big loss. But quite simply, these Longhorns look incredible on both sides of the ball right now, and they've got a huge advantage through the air as Jordan McLeod tore UTSA up last week. I'd expect another great half or so from Ewers as Texas rolls on to 3-0. I'll go with a 45-6 final. Vanderbilt's off to a 2-0 start with home wins over Virginia Tech and Alcorn State, thanks to a really solid run game putting up over 400 yards in the 2 wins. Diego Pavia has been really efficient as a passer, but it's typically just a short game right now. But they've been turnover free so far and have played some great defense. And now they get their first road matchup at Georgia State. This should be a game Vanderbilt wins without too much of a sweat, as just last week this team almost dropped a home game to Chattanooga. But we'll have to see if Vandy can keep up this level of play. I'll trust it for now and go with a 31-17 road victory. Eastern Michigan takes on Jacksonville State again this week after dropping last year's matchup on the road, and through 2 weeks, this looks like 2 completely different teams. It's the home opener for the Eagles, and after hanging in against Washington, I think this team has a little momentum entering this game. Jacksonville State's 0-2 with 2 blowout losses to Coastal and Louisville, so maybe they try and right the ship, but I just think Eastern looks like the better team right now. I think they win the home opener and get revenge from last season's beatdown, 27-23 EMU. Kennesaw State's tough entrance to the FBS level continues this week with a road trip out to San Jose State, a team who does look a little better than I expected through the first 2 weeks, mostly due to the play of Emmett Brown, but the signs are still there that this is a weaker FBS team that has some issues. Kennesaw was a pretty scrappy team week 1 and just really struggled to stop the Cajun rush attack last week, but I think San Jose State is much closer to Kennesaw as a team than Louisiana was. I don't think this is an impossible game for the Owls, and I expect them to avoid a blowout here, but I am taking San Jose State to win it at home, 28-13. Western Kentucky at Middle Tennessee is another interesting game in the Group of 5 this week. TJ Finley bounced back after his horrific day at Alabama with a 350-yard day against Eastern Kentucky, and Middle Tennessee just got demolished by an elite Ole Miss team. I think there's a definite gap between these 2 teams, but Western Kentucky is going to need to prove that on the road, and I just think Finley's a far better quarterback than Vadiato, and this same MTSU team nearly lost to Tennessee Tech at home week 1. I'm not going to trust them to beat a team that's flat out better, so give me Western Kentucky 30-20. Hawaii is back in action after an early bye, and they're heading out to take on Sam Houston State. This should be a tough matchup for both teams, as Sam Houston may have a legitimately decent group this season, and I still really believe in Hawaii's offense with Shager at quarterback. They nearly pulled off the upset in week 1 against UCLA, and I think that should give them some confidence after the bye heading into this game. As long as they aren't giving the ball away, I actually like their chances to come away with a road victory here, even as an underdog. I'm rolling with Hawaii close, 28-24. South Florida really battled at Alabama last week until a late fourth quarter surge by the Tide, but I think that proved what we knew about this South Florida team. They may have a shot in the American this season with the way they can run the ball, especially if Byron Brown gets going through the air. Tate Rodemaker didn't look too bad last week for Southern Miss, but it was only Southeast Louisiana. I think USF's going to give this team some fits, especially with that ground game. I like South Florida to get it done on the road, 34-21. Number 1, Georgia's on the road this week at Kentucky, and based on the way the Kentucky offense has looked through 2 weeks, this could be an absolute nightmare game for the Wildcats. Just 6 points mustered up last week at home against South Carolina, and now they get Georgia. Maybe we see a better Kentucky team show up knowing what they're up against, but it's hard not to trust Georgia to control this game. I like the Dogs to cover on the road, 38-10. Auburn will take on New Mexico Saturday night, looking to bounce back after the brutal loss to Cal. Just 14 points scored last week after a 73-point start to the season against Alabama A&M. Peyton Thorne looked a lot like the Peyton Thorne we all know. We'll see a better game out of this offense as they're taking on a really bad New Mexico team, but New Mexico put up 39 at Arizona a couple weeks ago and may be able to score a bit here. If they do, I'm not sure you can trust Auburn to score 50+ to cover a 4-touchdown spread, so I'm going with the 41-17 final for the Tigers. Mississippi State will host Toledo this week as less than 2-touchdown favorites, and maybe for good reason as they got absolutely gashed on the ground last week by Cam Scatterbo and Arizona State. But lucky for them, Toledo has not ran the ball well through 2 games, splitting carries up and totaling 250 yards combined against Duquesne and UMass. For the Bulldogs, I actually think Blake Shapen has looked pretty solid in this offense. Toledo could end up a legit test, but I like what I've seen out of Shapen so far and think they'll be able to score in this game. Give me the Bulldogs by 2 scores, 34-20. Indiana heads out to UCLA this week, looking great to start the season. I really did believe they'd be much better than expectations after all the talent they brought in the portal, but this is the first real test for the Hoosiers. On the road in a conference game, UCLA does not look great, but they're rested after the bye and already tested as they escaped a loss at Hawaii in week 1. But right now, it's hard not to side with the Hoosiers with how they've played. I'm not a fan of Ethan Garbers and actually predicted UCLA to finish much lower than Indiana in the Big Ten standings. So I'm taking Indiana on the road to get this one done, 31-24. Baylor really struggled to get anything going at Utah last week until Cam Rising went down, and that's not really a big knock as Utah does have a strong defense. But honestly, Daquan Finn has not looked that great through 2 games, and neither has the Baylor run game. I think it's a definite concern at this point and something they need to figure out for the season, and this week could be that chance as they get Air Force coming down. Air Force does have a solid defense, but again replaces a ton of production and has not shown a pulse offensively yet. This should be a game where Baylor gets going unless that offense just continues to struggle, but I do trust the Bears to get it done, 30-13. Colorado at Colorado State may end up being the most anticipated game of the week for obvious reasons, as Colorado took an absolute beatdown last week at Nebraska and will look to respond against their in-state rival who nearly took them down last season in Boulder amid some controversy. CSU has not looked great through the 2 games and even struggled a bit with Northern Colorado, but we saw Nicolosi and Horton get on track after a no-show against Texas, and it's perfect timing as this could be their most important game of the year. As we saw last year, these type of games typically go down to the wire regardless, and I haven't seen enough improvement from Colorado to think they'll win this one by any more than a touchdown. But I am going to trust Shadur and Travis to escape with a win by a field goal, 34-31. UCF at TCU could end up being the best game of the nightcap. Just the 1-point spread in favor of TCU right now, as UCF has looked really good offensively through 2 weeks. And the same goes for TCU, as Josh Hoover has been great, and they've got some playmakers for him as well. I think this will be a back and forth game between 2 solid offenses with a bit different styles, and should end up going down to the wire. But I just really love the UCF run game right now with Harvey and Boone, and even KJ Jefferson as a mobile quarterback. I'm going to take UCF to come out on top really close, 31-28. Tennessee has looked absolutely dominant with Nico at the reins, coming off an absolute thrashing of NC State last week, showing off on both sides of the ball. This team may end up a legitimate playoff threat and should get an opportunity to get some backups a little experience this week against Kent State. The question is going to be, can they cover a near 50-point spread? And honestly, I think even the backups will be able to move the ball against this Kent State team. I'm not going to fade the Vols right now. I like them to put up 50+. I'll go with a 56-3 final. Maryland at Virginia is a tough one Saturday night. Virginia looking a bit better than expected, taking down Wake Forest on the road, and Maryland coming off a home loss to Michigan State. This will be another one of those games all about how the team responds after a loss, but I like what I'm seeing out of Anthony Calandria right now. Aiden Childs was pretty sloppy last week and still threw for 350 yards on the Terps. I'd expect Virginia to try to air it out as well and use his arm and Malachi Fields to their advantage. Maryland definitely has some talent, but last week's results has me leaning against Virginia right now on the road. I like Virginia, 27-24. Houston looked much better last week at Oklahoma compared to their week 1 blowout against UNLV, and despite the loss, a lot of it had to do with Donovan Smith being much more effective as a passer, and the defense playing a really solid game, limiting the Sooners to just 2 touchdowns. Rice is coming off a blowout win against Texas Southern, which was a nice response after the week 1 loss to Sam Houston. But if you can't beat Sam Houston at home, why should you be able to win this one on the road? Give me the Cougars to win and cover, 28-20. BYU heads out to Wyoming Saturday night as a double-digit favorite, and honestly, they've really impressed me through 2 games, blowing out a solid FCS team in Southern Illinois, and then taking down SMU on the road. SMU has some issues right now, but that's a really strong win regardless, and Wyoming looks legitimately awful right now. A thumping from Arizona State and a loss to FCS Idaho. Now, yes, Idaho did take Oregon down to the wire, but there's absolutely no reason to trust Wyoming right now. The offense looks terrible without Harrison Whaley, so give me BYU on the road, 31-14. Cal will host San Diego State this week, looking to keep building off their 2-0 start with wins over UC Davis and last week's road win over Auburn. The defense looks really good right now, forcing turnovers and getting stops, and Fernando Mendoza had a really solid game last week, throwing for 230 yards and 2 touchdowns. Jaden Ott still hasn't gotten going and may miss his contest with an injury, but it hasn't really stopped Cal just yet. San Diego State looked terrible last week against Oregon State, getting shut out. Danny O'Neal is going to go through some growing pains as a true freshman starter, and I'm not going to rely on him to perform in his first road start. I like Cal to keep it rolling, 34-13. The final game of the week is New Mexico State at Fresno State. Fresno picked up win number 1 over Sacramento State last week. They led this one 28-3 in the first half, and Sacramento State got their offense going to make it more of a game. Nonetheless, we saw Mikey Keene sling the rock, throwing for over 350 yards, and that should be able to continue this week at home again. New Mexico State's coming off an absolute heartbreaker as they played their tails off and still fell short to Liberty after giving up 21 fourth quarter points. I was shocked they were in that game regardless, and I don't love the spot they're in after that loss. Give me Fresno big, 38-14. That's it for my Week 3 picks. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, as well as your upset predictions and favorite games you're looking forward to this week. As always, thanks for watching. Feel free to like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.